When a job is wrapping up, it's only natural to turn an eye to what comes next. Folks getting out of the military can speak with people trained in supporting service members transitioning into civilian life and get one-on-one support with resume writing, job applications, and interview preparation. That route isn't for everyone, and some people forge their own path back into civilian life. For Airman Cook, preparing for his administrative separation from the Air Force, that path looked like partnering up with one of his close friends in a transportation job. Instead of long-haul trucking or even DoorDash, though, the duo decided to get into human smuggling. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In episodes 20, the Easterly case, and 38, the Brinkman-Coronel case, I discussed crimes committed after somebody was already being separated from the military. In Easterly's case, it was a medical separation, and in Brinkman-Coronel's case, it was separation for failing a urinalysis test following the consumption of cocaine. Unlike those two cases, which both took place in Hawaii, today's lame duck crimes took place in Arizona. Airman Cook enlisted in the Air Force out of his hometown in Florida sometime around 2019 when he was approximately 21 years old. He had completed a couple of years at Northwest Florida State College, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like that worked out. Cook enlisted on a 6-year contract, which is a little unusual, but the appellate opinion in this case didn't dive into the terms of that initial contract. Following his airman onboarding at Lockland, Cook shipped out to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona for his first tour. The base is an Air Combat Command installation named after two Arizonan World War I-era pilots who managed to survive the war, but who died in separate military aircraft crashes after the war concluded, one of which may have included an ill-fated duck hunt. If it seems like an unlikely coincidence that the two died in unrelated, non-conflict crashes, I'd offer a quick reminder that planes were only invented 11 years before the First World War began. While the base itself hosts a variety of wing units, it is perhaps best known for housing the aircraft boneyard, a mission that began after the end of hostilities in World War II. The boneyard stores excess military and U.S. government aircraft and aerospace vehicles. For that grand scale of the base, it's not entirely the most remote, and it sits just 5 miles southeast of downtown Tucson. And it seems like that airbase wasn't quite remote enough, because Cook kept finding ways to get hold of federally illicit marijuana. On June 24, 2021, he received non-judicial punishment related to multiple consumptions of marijuana between April 15th and June 7th. Following these incidents and his non-judicial punishment, Cook consumed marijuana at least 6 additional times between June and September. Because of all of these violations, Cook, who was just 2 years into his Air Force career, was already pending administrative separation. Administrative separation is a process to remove someone from the military. Defense lawyers are involved out of an abundance of protection of due process rights, because you can't deny somebody their property, their financial interest in maintaining a job, without due process. But administrative separation doesn't happen in a courtroom and doesn't include a judge. Which is to say, administrative separations and pre-1946 courts-martial had a lot in common. Cook had a friend referred to as QM, who got out of the Air Force in June 2021, around the same time Cook began getting in trouble for his marijuana use. The two were very close and described themselves as practically brothers. In August, QM, who we'll call Quentin for the ease of storytelling, posted a Snapchat story about how he needed money, money, money. I like to think that it included the ABBA song, but I'm probably wrong. Quentin and his fiancée were expecting their first child, and Quentin no longer had his Air Force income to support them. Because the documents I found related to this case are focused on Cook, none of them list why Quentin left the Air Force and that income and guaranteed basic allowance for housing. Quentin received a reply on Snapchat from a stranger offering an easy $500 per person to transport undocumented immigrants within the United States. He wouldn't need to cross the border concealing anybody, he just needed to give people rides. About a week after Quentin received the job offer, for a lack of a better word, Cook hitched a ride with him to the Tucson International Airport to pick up a rental Jeep Cherokee to get him through the weekend. Both Quentin and Cook owned their own cars, but the appellate opinion doesn't explain what kind of cars they were. I'm specifically curious about what sort of car Cook drove. The following day, Quentin called Cook and asked him to extend his 24-hour rental by an additional day. After extending the rental, the two drove to Sierra Vista with Quentin's fiancée, ostensibly to sightsee. Then they drove to Phoenix and dropped off Quentin's fiancée. They returned to the Sierra Vista area sometime around 10 p.m., before turning off the main highway to travel on what is generously described as a dirt road near Hereford, Arizona. They followed turn-by-turn directions from Quentin's Snapchat friend and came to a stop to allow a man in a gray shirt to open the hatchback of the Jeep and load 3 people into the back seat and 2 into the rear hatch area. As they pulled away, Cook noticed the 5 passengers duck down as they passed a marked Arizona Department of Public Safety vehicle. Cook claims he asked why the passengers were ducking, and I can't decide if he offered that to show that he thought that what he and Quentin were doing was totally fine. To the extent he thought what they were doing was totally kosher, I'll note that in the center console, he had his registered Glock 45 loaded with 15 bullets. He'd driven to a dark, remote part of the desert where a stranger loaded 5 people into a car he rented instead of bringing his own vehicle. To the extent he thought the ducking would draw attention, I'd again point out that they were very slowly off-road driving through a remote part of the desert under the cover of darkness just a handful of miles from the border. Their mere presence was always going to draw attention, whether or not that Department of Public Safety officer could see people ducking in the back of the Jeep. At approximately 10:30 that night, that officer with the Arizona Department of Public Safety apprehended the vehicle. The 5 people packed into the back of the Jeep were 5 foreign nationals dressed in camouflage, wearing carpet shoes and feigning sleep. In researching for this case, I learned that carpet shoes are shoes that are made out of a carpet-like material and are worn over traditional shoes in order to obscure footprints. Before we get too much further, I'm going to take the opportunity to explain the distinction between asylum seekers and people who cross the border outside of the system of regulations and rules, outside the system of laws. Much of the current border crisis is driven not by illegal crossing, but the system of parole for asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are individuals operating within the system of rules and regulations who arrive at the border without advance authorization for entering this country. Everyone has their own reasons for traveling to the border and seeking entry, though many are fleeing increasing violence, political violence, profound economic dislocation or stagnation, and natural disasters. Venezuela seems an apt example. Venezuela used to be one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, relying heavily on their oil reserves for state revenue. When oil prices began to dip, Venezuela produced less oil and kick-started an economic crisis. The government failed to cut spending in the face of falling revenue, denied the existence of a crisis, and began violently repressing opposition. Extrajudicial killings by the government became routine and were carried out as reprisal for participation in anti-government demonstrations. The economic crisis in Venezuela is widely regarded as worse than the Great Depression, but the corresponding humanitarian crisis is not assisted by the complete lack of protections that we are afforded under things like our First Amendment. The government's severe and ineffective response to the economic downturn has only served to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis, leaving Venezuelans struggling with dire shortages of food, medicine, and other necessities, while simultaneously fearing brutal government repression. Hopeful migrants undertake dangerous voyages in an attempt to find safety, but their lack of documentation makes them particularly vulnerable to human smugglers and human traffickers. That trafficking can range from being forced to work in agricultural or housekeeping roles to being forced to engage in commercial sex. Much of the current border crisis is centered on the volume of people present at the border seeking asylum. Asylum seekers must present themselves at a port of entry, and if they can establish that they have a credible fear of persecution in their home country, they may be paroled into the United States to wait on this side of the border for a decision on their asylum application. It's not dissimilar to people who claimed sanctuary and asylum in medieval churches. When you hear about states packing people into buses and planes and sending them to different parts of the country, it's these groups of asylum seekers. With that background in mind, I'll return to Cook, Quentin, and the 5 camouflaged strangers in the back of their rental Jeep. Quentin's Snapchat friend contacted him at least 8 times that night via WhatsApp, an encrypted messaging platform. While Quentin and Cook waited to speak with Homeland Security agents, they used their time productively and factory reset their phones. Strong, from episode 26, might be impressed with their efficacy. During their initial questioning, Quentin explained that they were just in the area to explore. They were going slowly because they wanted to avoid any potholes. He insisted that they weren't expecting to see people out in the desert at night, but upon discovering them, they decided to be generous and give them a ride. Homeland Security agents explained that that sounded very made up, and that they didn't believe him. They told him they were considering whether or not to charge him. This made Quentin fess up. He explained that he desperately needed money, and that he'd been solicited on Snapchat. He tried to take care of Cook, to shield him from the blame. He said the loaded gun in the car didn't belong to either of them, and that Cook didn't know that the plan was to pick anyone up. Cook's initial story lined up with Quentin's protective one. He said he didn't know that there was any plan to pick people up. He explained to the agents that his car was broken, that he'd rented the Jeep so he could go sightseeing with Quentin and his fiancée. Then he said it wasn't broken, but that it was at a Firestone repair shop for a diagnostic exam and general checkup so that he could drive his car back to Florida later, probably when the Air Force was done administratively separating him. He told agents that the gun that was registered to him, belonged instead to someone named Taylor. But if Cook believed that he was just extending his rental Jeep an extra day so that he and his friends could joyride around southern Arizona and see the sights of the remote desert, it doesn't make much sense to bring a gun, whether that gun was his or Taylor's. When agents inquired as to why he wiped his phone, Cook explained that he hadn't actually wiped his cell phone. He'd done it inadvertently by misentering his PIN 10 consecutive times. I know that there are members of Gen Z who are opting to carry dumb phones as opposed to smartphones who might be flummoxed by the PIN. But Cook so obviously wasn't one of them, and this was a patently unbelievable explanation. Later, an expert testified to all the ways they knew Cook lied when he made this statement. Border Patrol agents asked Cook if he knew that the people who clambered into his rental car were unlawfully in the United States. He said he kind of knew, but that he hadn't looked in the back, as though making direct eye contact would be the big giveaway. Without the WhatsApp messages, agents couldn't discern who it was that had contacted Quentin and arranged this entire night. About 9 hours after they were initially detained, Border Patrol agents released both Cook and Quentin and notified the Air Force that Cook had been arrested on suspicion of illegally transporting aliens. Air Force investigators picked up where Homeland Security left off and also interviewed Cook. Cook again explained that his car was broken and in the Firestone shop, and that he rented the Jeep to go sightseeing. When questioned, he couldn't provide an address or even general location for the shop his car was allegedly receiving repairs or diagnostic tests or whatever his claim was. He reasserted that the gun was not his. He explained that he'd actually sold that gun that was found in his possession to someone named Lloyd nearly 18 months earlier in March 2020. He explained that he'd even executed a bill of sale for the transaction. It's unclear whether he offered any explanation for how it then came to be in the center console of a Jeep he'd rented for 48 hours. Any surprise Cook feigned at seeing Quentin pick up 5 strangers seemed awfully disingenuous. When Air Force investigators asked why he didn't begin questioning Quentin when they started off-road roaming in the Arizona desert, Cook explained that they were still passing Border Patrol troopers and other barriers to illegally transporting migrants, so he didn't think Quentin would, quote, actually go through with it. If you're not read in on the plan to transport aliens, you probably wouldn't notice the Border Patrol agents or know that somebody was going through with anything. Investigators then visited all 3 Firestone locations. They didn't find any evidence Cook's vehicle had received services there at any point relevant to the investigation. Next, they pulled the registration form for the Glock and discovered Cook bought the gun in January 2021, making a sale in March 2020 to Lloyd, Taylor, or anyone else impossible. Nevertheless, they checked his barracks room to see if there was any kind of bill of sale. As you've likely guessed, they didn't find one, but they did find a Glock 45 gun case with a sticker that matched the serial number for the gun seized from the Jeep. A day after Cook returned to base, his commander read him the Riot Act and restricted him to base. Cook broke restriction that evening. Federal officials declined to prosecute Cook, but the Air Force had other plans. He faced 8 specifications at his general court-martial and entered a mixed plea. He pled guilty to 1 specification of being absent without leave for failing to report for duty while he was in Border Patrol custody, 1 specification of breach of restriction for leaving the base, and 1 specification of wrongful use of a controlled substance for his marijuana use on multiple occasions. He pled not guilty to 1 specification of illegally transporting aliens within the United States, 1 specification of conspiracy to illegally transport aliens within the United States, 1 specification of obstructing justice for wiping his phone, and 2 specifications related to illegal possession of a firearm and ammunition by a drug abuser. After the government rested its case in chief, the court, on its own motion, entered findings of not guilty on the specifications related to the illegal possession of a firearm and ammunition by a drug abuser. Cook was convicted of the remaining offenses. The military judge sentenced him to 27 months confinement, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction from E2 to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. Cook requested deferment of his reduction in rank and forfeitures, which the convening authority denied. On appeal, Cook raised 14 supposed errors. Through these errors, he challenged his convictions for factual insufficiency, legal insufficiency, failure to state an offense, asserted errors with a handful of evidentiary decisions, and that he was improperly sentenced. He argued in part that the court-martial should have dismissed the case because some of the witnesses to the offense were deported before trial. It doesn't seem to me like that would be a supportable precedent. Although Cook didn't get to cross-examine any of the people he and Quentin picked up that night, the fact that they were deported is pretty compelling evidence that they were in the country in contravention of federal law. In their interviews with Border Patrol, all 5 admitted to being foreign nationals who entered the United States without prior authorization. There wasn't anything to indicate that these supposedly lost witnesses could have provided favorable testimony for Cook. In addition to these 14 claimed errors, the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals identified a 15th issue they considered and rejected for the sake of completeness. Cook's case took more than 18 months for the AFCCA to address. Cook raised his own Moreno or Tardif error, but focused on the 200-day delay between his sentencing and docketing his appeal with the court. We saw this issue come up and merit relief in episode 40, the Abdullah case. I think the most interesting issue is the claimed factual insufficiency. I don't find it interesting because it had any hope of succeeding. But I think it's interesting because it's the first case I've covered here analyzing factual insufficiency under the post-Wilson standard. I was vocally skeptical on whether the intermediate appellate courts would apply the standard in a way that aligns the military courts with their civilian counterparts. That is, whether they would display the same level of deference for findings of fact that I see in the civilian system. I'm happy to report that the realignment has been largely successful and that the reviewing courts have emphasized their role. That it is no longer to substitute their judgment for the judgment of the fact finder at court-martial. They seem to have embraced the new standard, evaluating whether they are clearly convinced that the weight of the evidence supports the conviction, acknowledging that it was obtained under a much higher standard below. The AFCCA selected a handful of the asserted errors to discuss in the opinion and ultimately determined that Cook was entitled to relief on only one. The court determined that his confinement for going AWOL and breaking restriction exceeded the maximum punishment for each offense. To correct for the error, the court reassessed the segmented sentence for Specification 1 for going absent without leave, and reduced it from 2 months to 1 month, and the segmented sentence for Specification 2, breaking restriction, and reduced that segment for 2 months to 1 month as well. They otherwise affirmed the sentence as entered, the confinement for 27 months, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction from E2 to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to, rate, and review the podcast. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we return to what I'm realizing is becoming a theme of this podcast: men who murder their pregnant partners. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.